I'm going to present a little bit of a framework as a way for us to think about the complexity of navigating the contradictions that we're in, right? Like we want to create um, like People's Solar Energy Fund is about creating community-owned and controlled clean energy, and that that's not free. That has costs associated with it, and requires capital. Um, and so we're constantly in this position of navigating this contradiction of how do we do something that's in its heart and soul fundamentally against capitalism and privatization, but also navigating the contradiction of that's the space we're in, right? So I'm going to offer a framework to think about that, um, and then I'll open it up. We can have some discussion about the ways in which you all are contemplating that, and I'll give you a few examples of what folks are trying to do. If that works, hopefully this will be useful. And if not, at least you'll know what you don't want. Um, all right, I'm going to do a little screen sharing here. So does that work? You all looking at a screen that has a little quote on it? I heard this quote from my friend Jahan Garan. I'm not sure where it comes from, but Jahan is Navajo, Black and Navajo, and was the executive director of Black Mesa Water Coalition some years ago. When she says, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors; we borrow it from our children," and I think this. This is a great way of articulating this core idea that I'm going to dig into, which is this notion of the commons and how we create commons and the role of commons in this work. So I'll get to that in a second. First, we're going to do a little interactive thing. So you can take out your phone and you can open up this little QR code, and it'll take you to Mentimeter, or you can go to menti.com in another tab and type in that code, and it's going to ask you a question. So everybody can try and get there. And I'm going to open up the chat too, just in case anybody has any troubles. And I'm going to quickly switch my screen share for a second, so we can look at the other thing that I want to show you. And I see that people are in there, so I'm going to see if this goes. Oops, that didn't work. Okay. Screen share again here for a second. You can see what we're looking at. So you'll have the question, which is, why do you want community-owned, cooperatively governed clean energy? And I'm going to invite everybody to put in a few different responses. Yeah, look at that. Okay, so adaptive capacity, co-governance, human rights, yes. A hedge against monopolies, families first, justice, colonialism, or maybe decolonization, abundance, progression, restoration, liberation, freedom. Interesting. So there's an interesting. I'm going to invite some folks to share some thoughts really quick. I love that I see reparations and freedom on here. It looks like a few people put that in, or at least a couple people. Does anybody want to say how they see community-owned, cooperatively governed clean energy as a form of reparations. Somebody who put reparations on, you want to unmute and share a little bit about why you put that there? Somebody definitely typed it in. It wasn't me.
Yeah, I can go ahead and speak to that. This is Jessica, yep. And the reason I put reparations is because um, I- I feel like community-owned, cooperatively governed clean energy um, is a right. Like it's just to be able to do so. But I also feel like by being able to own that, um, there's a lot of potential to heal historic violence. Um, and in a way that's very much grounded in material reality. I feel a lot of times when there are conversations about reparations or racial justice, it's people get caught up in semantics or performance, and I feel like energy makes it very real. Like, how is this nation, how are Black and Indigenous communities going to actually have these generations of violence repaired? So yeah, that's why I put the word reparations.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. Thank you for that. I always like to point out that reparations isn't simply it is amends for past harms, but it's not only amends for past harms. Reparations has to repair the relationships such that the harm can never happen again. Otherwise, it's not really reparations. Um, so appreciate that, this idea of new systems that meet that. Some of you might know Ed Whitfield. Ed Whitfield is with New Economy Coalition and the Seed Commons, which I'll talk about in a second. But he points out that 40 acres and a mule was um, wasn't just wasn't just a demand around reparations. What's really important about it is that 40 acres land and a mule labor are productive units. It's not a payment for past harms. It's the ability to actually control your own labor and to make a livelihood for yourself. It's fundamentally different than compensation. It's actually productive units so that you can build power and economy of your own. And that's something that's really important when we talk about reparations now. We often convert it from productive units to consumptive units, like just a payout. Where we're not we're not necessarily investing in the power of people to control their own economies and define for themselves their own economies to meet their own needs. So thank you. There's a bunch of other awesome things on here. Safer communities. There's a lot about restoration and prioritizing families and human rights. So we're going to dig into some of that now. I just wanted to give you a chance to share a little because I know you all been in this program for a little bit. So with that, I am going to, you would think as somebody who teaches at the university, I'd be better about the constant switching of slide decks. But here we go. All right. Okay. I'm going to share a little bit about commons as a frame for us to be able to explore how we can think differently about finance. So folks familiar with the concept of commons and commoning? Anybody like come across this idea before, or have you talked about the commons before? Okay, so commons refers to, here, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So commons refers to the governance of resources. It can be land, it could be labor, information, ideas, anything that are shared by many and therefore have to be available and sustained to be used by many over generations. So first of all, commons is the pre-existing condition. Privatization the privatizing of things, um, is an infringement upon what existed before, which was the commons. It's a way, it's the English word for expressing the way in which communities self-governed things that they all depended on. So you can give you lots of examples. Water's primarily governed as commons, or was for most people around the world. One way to think about it is a community well, is a commons. Everyone has access to the well. There are rules that the community develops together about the governance of it, how much you can take, when you can take it, right? To make sure that it's sustained over time because everybody depends on it for a long time, right? Land, all land used to be governed as commons, right? Um, and this is it's not a free for all. So there's this idea that used to exist, that there's this guy, Garrett Hardin. He wrote a paper called The Tragedy of the Commons. He's uh, a self-avowed Western chauvinist. Um, but in 1968, so he's a white supremacist economist, and he wrote a paper saying, well, the problem with the commons is everybody just does whatever they want, and everybody acts in their own self-interest, and then the land gets degraded, and the only way to protect land is to privatize it. But it's based on a completely false assumption, which is that the commons is in fact a free-for-all. It's not. There are these principles around which communities self-govern resources, and they're common around the world. Even though they're autonomously developed and the rules look different in different places, there are some basic things. Like one for example, is that for a commons to work, the community has to design it, the governance, and create the mechanism for managing the commons. So for example, if the government builds a well in a community, it doesn't work as a commons, but if the community builds the well in the community and sets the rules, then it works as a commons. Commons are all based on consent. That means the commoners, the people who are practicing them, all agree together on the rules that govern the commons. And they all have access to the process of governance and the ability to inform the changes in the rules. So when we talk about community-owned, controlled, and democratically governed clean energy, we're talking about a commons of energy, as opposed to the privatization of energy, right? So there are big commons and there are small commons. The oceans are commons. It's a global commons. Everybody depends on the ocean. I mean, that is what regulates the thermal mass of the thermal mass of the planet is basically water, right? Like the oceans is everybody's, it's a commons of the whole world, but we don't govern it as a commons. We've allowed it to be privatized and degraded through overfishing, through industrialism, through all these different things, right? And the atmosphere was a commons, except it was overexploited by settler colonialism, slavery, which led to industrialism, which led to capitalism. So we have these process of degrading the commons. But all commons are predicated on cooperation and consent. Those are the foundations of commons. There are two examples I have here. There's a really cute dog making noise next to me. Um, uh, um, are folks familiar with the acequias in New Mexico? They also are in Spain and the Middle East. The acequias are a community-controlled for governance system for managing water irrigation so that everyone has fair access to the water, that through a series of canals and check dams and locks that are community made, community designed, that help make sure everybody gets access to water. And the community comes together, they designate somebody who manages the flow of water. They have rules around who gets their water when. Everybody agrees to those rules, right? And then they self-govern it. This comes from uh, the Arab world and then came to Moorish Spain and then spread around Europe and then came to the Americas. And there's lots of versions of this all over the world, but the acequias are the one that are common to us. So it's a commons of water, commons management system for water. Or here we have people-powered solar co-op, which was the way solar works in the United States, residential solar works in the United States, is if you own a private roof, you get to put private solar on it. But what if a community member said they're going to put their roofs, the roofs of their homes, into the commons so that the whole community can control and own and govern the energy that's produced. So it doesn't just go to rolling back their meter, but it goes into this common pool resource of energy that they self-govern how they manage both the energy and the revenues, right? So that's what People Power Solar worked on in California. That's an example of commons. And of course, all the solar co-ops that you all are building are essentially commons, right? Even if you find, you may have to interconnect with the grid, you may have to do all these other things that involve navigating privatization or quasi-privatization, right? Quasi-privatization meaning the government acts as a private entity, even though it's supposed to be for the people, right? So that's commons. And I think it's really important to know that all commons is predicated on consent. Now I'm going to talk about the opposite of commons, which is what we predominantly experience in the world, which is enclosure. All enclosure is based on entitlement. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by entitlement? So anybody know who the picture is of the lady with the big hat? Folks recognize the lady with the big hat? She's very famous. Very recently died. That's the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. Which is just I don't want to offend anybody, but I think the death of a monarch is always untimely because it can never happen soon enough. But the Queen of England, who recently died, and the reason I have her picture there is because, oh, are you not seeing my slides? Is it not showing
What
up?
what we're seeing is commons and consent. That's the
Oh,
last thing.
how about now? What are you looking at? What are you looking at now?
I'm still seeing commons and consent.
Oh, what? That's
What you
weird.
can do is you can send me your PowerPoint and I can be the person who's doing the slides if maybe something's
Spell it.
happening with your computer.
Hold on. Let me just stop that for a second. I think it got paused somehow. Don't know what I did. Let's try that. And then if that works. Now you're looking at the Queen of England. Okay. No wonder nobody guessed who it was. Makes perfect sense. Yeah, so there's the Queen of England. And the reason I got the Queen of England there is because this is the origin of the notion of title. You know, when you buy a house and they give you the title, it's called a title because the origin of the enclosure of the commons in Western civilization is literally the queen with that stick going, Corbin, you are now the Duchess of, or the Duke of whatever, the Duke of Piddlywink. And because you are now the Duke, you are entitled, with that title, you are entitled to go and build a hedge around what was once the commons and claim it as your own. Right? So all privatization is based on this illegitimate authority that is bestowed through the structure of law and goes back to the monarchy, right? So I want to say a couple things about that. Something really important about enclosures. Not only are all enclosures based on entitlement, but all enclosures are inherently enforced through violence. It doesn't matter whether it's the fence around my house or the border around the nation state, right? The fence around my private home is enforced through the violence of policing, and the border around the nation state is enforced through the violence of militaries. Any enclosure, in order to be enforced, has to be backed up with some meaningful threat of or execution of violence. That's how you maintain an enclosure. And that's ultimately how you convert the commons to enclosed land, is through this process. Does that make sense? Right? If you want to, you need new frontiers to extract from, you need violence and militarism to get them. That's just the reality. Like, if I want to have a private yard, telling people they can't come in isn't good enough. I got to have some kind of, way to maintain it. Okay. Last thing I want to say is the real power of enclosure is not just the ability to keep people out. The real power of enclosure is to determine the terms and conditions by which people get access to that which is enclosed. I'll say that again. The power of enclosure isn't really in the idea of keeping people out, saying it's mine and only I can use it. The real power of enclosure is the ability to determine the terms and conditions by which people get access to that which is enclosed. If you do a Google image search for the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, you'll get this picture of the cow. And I think it's a really great metaphor for what I'm talking about. So there's this cow, and it sees the fresh, green, yummy grass on the inside of the enclosure, on the other side of the fence. And it's like trying to get at the grass, right? So it doesn't, because that's where all the good grass is now, because it's all been privatized. And then the farmer comes out and opens up the gate, lets the cow in, and closes the gate. And now the cow is on the inside, enjoying the grass on the inside, happily munching on the fresh green grass, waiting to become beef. Simply getting access to the enclosure makes you part of the enclosure and just another resource to be extracted from. The solution isn't making sure everybody has access to the enclosure. The solution is ending the enclosures. And this is really important. We all do this all the time, right? Raise your hand if you think housing is a human right, or give me an emoji if you think housing is a human right. Great. Raise your hand if you think the rent's too damn high. Yeah, you'd be an idiot not to, right? Raise your hand if you pay your rent. Yeah, you don't pay your rent because you think it's legitimate, clearly, because you all said housing was a human right. And you don't pay your rent because you think it's fair. Obviously, it's not fair, because if housing was a human right, then the only qualification for getting housing would be being a human being. You pay your rent because you have no other way to get your housing needs met. It is because the right to land and housing has been enclosed, and now the privatization of that resource, land and housing, the terms and conditions by which you get access to housing is controlled by those who control the enclosure. And we make this mistake all the time in our social movements. We think our liberation comes from getting access to that which we've been excluded from, as opposed to fundamentally changing the structures of governance that exclude us from them. Does that all make sense? Okay, I'm going to move to, we used to always say that the mother of all enclosures was the enclosure of land. The first enclosure is the enclosure of land, right? But now dominant finance is the enclosure that enables all other enclosures. Dominant finance is the enclosure of capital. Financial capital. What is financial capital? It's just a degraded form of clean air, healthy soil, fresh water, and our time. That's all it is. That's all that money is. It's a degraded form of the true capital that is the means of production, which is life itself, right? I always tell my students, I ask my students who controls the means of production, and all the lefties in my class will say, the bourgeois, the corporations, and I'm like, no, the photosynthesizing organisms control the means of production on planet Earth. And we're all just downstream from there, right? They take energy from the sun, they convert it into power to do work. And we're all just dependent on that. And so this idea that capital is a degraded form, an extracted form of the real wealth, which is the labor of the living world, and that the use of finance to control our access to that needed resource. And so we have to figure out how to create commons of capital. And that's because that has become, I like to say that we're all under Locke and Keynes, John Locke, who basically talked about the rational man and self-interest, and Maynard Keynes, who helped reconcile the contradictions of capitalism by making us, by piecing out little bits, giving people access here and there to keep the system functioning. So, this is the key thing here. Like, access to capital is the hardest thing for most of our projects. Actually, it's the second hardest thing for most of our projects. The thing that results in the failure of the vast majority of projects, whether it's community-owned cooperative solar or worker co-ops or community co-ops, is our inability to self-govern effectively. But the second biggest challenge is we don't have access to capital. Okay. And because almost all capital is now enclosed through private systems of privatization, we have to figure out how to access that capital in a different kind of way. And so I'm going to offer you a framework for that. And I'm going to try and do this fast because I'm talking a lot. How much time do we got?
So for your presentation, if you can have it finished like within 10 minutes.
Okay,
So
yes.
that
I got like 2 more slides.
Awesome. Yay.
Okay, sorry. I didn't realize I was going so long. Okay, I'm going to offer you 3 ideas of investment. There's extractive investment, inward investment, and internal investment. Extractive investment is when to invest, to put into, actually vestments. To invest is to put power into something, like the vestments of power. So to invest, so extractive investments are when the investor puts just enough resources in to take more wealth out. A good example of that is a Walmart. A Walmart will put just enough money into the community to take more wealth out. Payday lending will put just enough money into community to take more wealth out. An oil company, a mining company, an investor-owned utility put just enough investment in to take more wealth out, to extract wealth from the community, right? That we're all familiar with extractive investment. Then there's something we think of as inward investment, and that's where somebody who controls capital or some entities which control capital make investments into a community for some outcome that they seek. So for example, stimulus money is an inward investment. The Inflation Reduction Act is inward investment. The infrastructure bill, those are inward investments. Philanthropy, that's an inward investment, where investment is put in towards some purpose and outcome that may or may not benefit the community, but is not usually defined by the community in most cases. And that's what charity is. And often inward investment creates dependencies. Also, large inward investments like the IRA or stimulus money tend to default to extractivism, because who's ready to absorb hundreds of millions of dollars quickly to do shovel-ready projects or community revitalization? They're the developers, whose sole purpose is to extract wealth from the community by putting the least amount of effort in, right? The least amount of investment in. So often inward investment defaults to extractive investment or creates dependencies. Internal investment is when the wealth generated in a community stays in the community. And there's lots of examples of this. Community lending, cooperative financial institutions, um, uh, what we have it with the seed commons, commons of capital, where we have non-extractive lending for community-owned cooperatives, for example. And we don't have a whole, if we were just depending on internal investment, meaning the wealth that we generate through our projects, then feed more projects and are controlled by the community and create more, it would take a very, very long time to get to scale. So we have to figure out a way to capture inward investment, but instead of just like most philanthropic dollars, we write grants, we get money, we do the thing for the grant, and then we got to write another grant. We're not actually building the capacity in our communities to regenerate the wealth through investment in our own communities. Instead, we need the inward investment to turn over the soil for internal investment. And that's what People's Solar Energy Fund is trying to do with cooperative financing for solar. That's what the Seed Commons is trying to do with non-extractive lending for worker-owned cooperatives, right? And so this is the idea that, what I'm trying to get to, commons of energy requires commons of capital. There's some principles I want to share about commons of capital, and then I'll stop. And this is the last slide is the People's Solar Energy Fund slide, so then I'm done. Are folks familiar with the Seed Commons? Have you talked about the Seed Commons and non-extractive lending? Okay, so the Seed Commons is based on, first of all, it's called the Seed Commons. I'm going to take credit for coming up with the name because I used to always use seed libraries as the metaphor. The way a seed library works, unlike a book library, the way a seed library works is you go and you borrow seeds from the seed library. You plant the seeds and you return seeds from what you planted. You don't return the seeds you borrowed, obviously, because you planted those. You return the seeds from what you planted. And there are a few principles around seed libraries. The first is when you borrow seeds from the seed library, they never give you all the seeds. Because if they give you every single last tomato seed they have and something goes wrong, there'll be no more tomatoes, right? So you get a portion of the tomato seeds. In addition, with the seeds, you get a knowledge. They tell you how to grow the seeds and they give you technical support, right? Because if you just keep giving out seeds and people don't have the support to grow the seeds well, then then you lose a lot of seed, right? When you return seeds, you return more seeds than the seeds you borrowed, and you must return with them the knowledge of how you grew them. Because anybody who grows tomatoes knows that the diversity of tomatoes doesn't just come from the seed. It comes from the sun and the water and the soil conditions and whether or not you sang to the plants, right? You get diversity of seeds through relationship. And so when you return the seeds, you got to return with it the knowledge of how you grew it. And then the final thing is that in order to borrow seeds from the seed library, you have to be a member of the seed library, which means you got to take your turn helping manage and govern and maintain the seed library. Now just change the word seed for capital. We lend, you only return from the productive, you only return through profit sharing. So you only return, you repay the loan based on the success of your cooperative. And you always return more than you borrowed so that you can grow the loan fund. And you are part of the governance of the loan fund because every dollar that comes in has to go right back out into the community again. So we built a $25, $30 million pool of funds, all of which it gets lent out to worker and community-owned cooperatives all over the country in a decentralized and locally autonomous but federated way. And everybody's obligated to participate in shared knowledge and shared learning. There's shared infrastructure, so everybody's not trying to reinvent the wheel. There's shared governance in terms of it is actually a cooperative, and that's how you get access to shared capital. Now, all that capital isn't just coming from the co-ops. That capital is also coming from inward investment. But just instead of just taking those grants and putting them into the running of the fund, we put them into the lending. And the idea is eventually we are kicking off enough surplus from our productive enterprises that we are now self-running, self-governing, and self-sustaining. And so that's really like the model that we are trying to find our way towards through People's Solar Energy Fund. And this is just some of the members of People's Solar Energy Fund, and this is an old slide, so maybe none of y'all are on here, but you should be. But what has been challenging, or what we have struggled with at PSEF, is this idea of how do you get capital at scale? And one of the things that people were using was tax equity flip financing. But that was all predicated on somebody with enough surplus tax burden, like had such a big tax burden that they could take their equity just in the form of the clean energy tax credit and the write-offs. That's how they would get their equity back. So they get the tax benefit and they put up the capital, and eventually we buy them out, right? And so when you start to pursue that, you end up finding yourself trying to create deals with Goldman Sachs or whoever else has enough of a tax burden that they're interested in the tax equity, even though they don't really care about solar. And we thought that that was going to be a functional model, and there are several projects who have run on that model. But now that's all been upended because now there's direct pay, and there's all these other things that are coming through some of the legislative changes. So people are now looking at other ways of financing projects. But the key thing here is we shouldn't be financing the projects on one-off bases. We should be trying to build the pool of capital so that we can control how projects get financed and that the capital itself is collectively governed. And that's the thing that I think we still need to figure out for PSEF.